Is hangboarding going to injure your fingers? Does Johnny's skinny legs hold him back from climbing? Today we've come to the depot to do some myth busting, and we're talking about 5 of the biggest myths we think might be holding you back from improving in your climbing. We've seen a few comments on our YouTube channel, particularly around the ones where we're talking about lower body training, about how training the lower body is going to put on weight and be detrimental to your climbing. Now, this is definitely a myth, and while it is somewhat true that putting on weight in your lower body might make things like campusing or very power-dependent moves in your upper body may be more difficult, in reality, there's so many climbing moves where putting on strength in your lower body is going to make climbing much easier or progress your ability. For example, dynos and dead points where you have to push powerfully through the lower body, and things like heel hooks where you're going to need very strong hamstrings to be able to pull in on those holds.
The fear is that the extra muscle mass will be detrimental to climbing performance. The truth is, the benefit of doing some regular lower body training will outweigh the negative effects of potentially gaining a little bit more muscle mass in the legs and increasing your body weight.
So as Johnny said, the reality is it's unlikely you're going to put on much weight in your lower body if you're training legs like most climbers do, maybe once a week. However, there are some people that might put on muscle mass quite quickly, quite naturally, have the genetics to be able to do that. However, if you are one of these people that put on muscle mass really easily, you probably already know about it. If you are concerned about putting on too much mass in your lower body, simply stick to the lower rep ranges, somewhere between 3 and 5, and keeping the weight fairly heavy, or working isometrics in your training, which is going to have a good strength stimulus, but less of a hypertrophy effect with your training.
So if you don't just want to be campsing everything or hanging off 6 more edges, then you should consider doing some lower body training.
Over both our coaching and climbing careers, we've almost never seen an injury happen on a fingerboard. I also put this question to James Walker, a physio that you might know from some of our other videos, and he concurred. He's pretty much never seen injuries happen on the fingerboard. Hangboarding may contribute to the overall training load that goes through the fingers and forearms, and this may contribute towards overuse injuries, but this is a result of poor programming and recovery management. It's not an inherent risk with the fingerboard itself.
Hangboarding is generally very safe in nature due to the slow onset of contraction when you're on the fingerboard compared to when you're climbing, and the fast dynamic contractions that may lead to eccentric loading of the fingers or when a foot pops when you're climbing. As long as you're keeping your ego in check and not going for PBs on every session, then you're likely to reduce your risk of injury with fingerboarding.
The idea of fingerboarding should primarily be to build strength and capacity in the fingers and forearms, and therefore increase your ability to tolerate more climbing. This can be a harmful myth. While it is true that strength to weight ratio is very important for climbing performance, what is even more important is your health and well-being. Where the light is better myth becomes really damaging is in individuals that already have a very low body fat percentage. It's not only detrimental to recovery and injury risk, it's also going to have consequences on mental health, youth development, and menstrual cycle.
In climbers that are already quite lean, increasing muscle mass may help performance and longevity in the sport. This may be especially true for comp climbers, where the demands are placed more on the shoulders than the fingers these days.
We've all been there, hobbling out of the gym, completely destroyed, no skin left, and taking days to recover. But is this a good strategy to actually getting better at climbing? Well, it is true that when training, you need to apply some stress to the body to be able to adapt and get better. This follows the progressive overload principle, where we try to apply a little bit more stress each time to the body to tell it to get that little bit better. However, our feelings of what enough training is may actually be way off what is needed.
Many climbers may be pushing themselves to what we call the maximum tolerable load. This is training as much as possible without getting injured, and is a very risky strategy. Most of us should be aiming for the minimum effective dose for the body to create adaptations to the training stimulus. This means doing just enough training to see your climbing improve, with also providing the minimum time to recover between sessions.
What Johnny is saying here is that climbers should be finding the sweet spot in training load, where they're doing enough to see a response, but they're not doing so much that we're hitting into that diminishing returns amount of training. For many forms of training, especially strength training, you want to be really emphasizing quality over quantity. If you end up leaving a strength training session feeling totally wiped out, the chances are you've done too much and all you did towards the end of that session was add training volume that is going to increase your recovery time and not much else.
When training power endurance, it's common to go to failure, and emptying the tank is good for building capacity. However, you want to maintain the quality, and if you're having to drop the intensity to complete all the sets, you may be better off finishing sooner.
Strength training as a beginner is almost a bit of a controversial topic because me and Johnny kind of slightly disagree on this topic, but at the same time we both see each other's points, and it's because we have different personal experiences and come from different backgrounds. So let's cover both of our experiences and see how you might be able to draw from this in your own way. So I started climbing when I was 18 years old, and climbing was my first major or serious sport. So I was not a general athlete before this. I had not done much training before it. And what I found is in the first 2 or 3 years of climbing, I ramped up the volume massively, and I ended up getting quite commonly tweaks in my shoulders, especially in my elbows. And looking back on that time, I wish I had done some conditioning, basic things like pull-ups and press-ups, just to support the structures in my body to support my climbing. Now, I think Johnny's experience is slightly different because he came from a different background.
So although I started climbing at a similar age to Josh, I had had a much more thorough training background leading into that. And actually when I started climbing, my training volume kind of reduced from what I was used to in my tennis days. This meant that when I started climbing, I was relatively strong for my grade and could often pull my way through climbs and not have to rely on my technique. Although I didn't have the injury problems that Josh suffered with in my early days of climbing, I do feel as though my technique and things held me back, and to some extent is still with me today.
And to bring a third experience to the table, Sam, who is behind the camera right now, started climbing when he was 12, I believe, so quite young, and actually said that he was just mainly climbing and didn't see any injuries. So although it was his first major sport and hadn't done any conditioning, he didn't see the injuries I might have seen when I started climbing. So this paints a picture of many different scenarios where we could argue building some strength training into your routine to support your climbing may be very beneficial, perhaps if you're starting later in life and it's your first major sport and you want to be building yourself as a general athlete to support your climbing. However, if you're young and in your developmental years and perhaps you're just going to rebound off doing any kind of training, then maybe it's not as important. Or if you're coming from a sport where you already have that base of general strength, perhaps most of your time is spent simply just focusing all of that volume on the skill-based practice. The primary reason for strength training within sport is to reduce injury risk. Building strength and coordination is very protective. It builds your capacity to tolerate the activity of your sport. So an argument for including basic exercises like pull-ups and press-ups, very simply at the end of a climbing session, is to support your longevity in those first few years of climbing and shouldn't be viewed as increasing your performance just yet. You're not trying to get stronger for the climbing. You can do that on the wall while practicing the skills. It's just to help you on your journey.
So that's it from us today.
If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time.